Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Our top story: there has been a major upset in the Richmond Park by-election, with the Liberal Democrats taking the seat from the former Conservative MP, Zac Goldsmith. Mr Goldsmith ran as an independent after he resigned from the party in protest at the government's decision to back a third runway at Heathrow. The Liberal Democrats candidate Sarah Olney won almost half of all the votes cast to overturn Mr Goldsmith's majority of 23,000. Here's our political correspondent, Chris Mason.
This is what British democracy looks like. Nocturnal arithmetic in a sports hall. Before the result, the best indicators are the smiles. Just look at the beaming Lib Dem, and then look at Zac Goldsmith.
Do you regret calling this by-election, Zac? So it's just gone 2 in the morning. There are the candidates. They've just been told the result. We're about to hear it. A historic night for the Liberal Democrats.
I hereby declare that the said Sarah Jane Olney is duly elected as Member of Parliament for the Richmond Park constituency.
In a year of political upsets, another. The first Lib Dem gain in a by-election for a decade.
The people of Richmond Park and North Kingston have sent a shockwave through this Conservative Brexit government, and our message is clear. We do not want a hard Brexit. We do not want to be pulled out of the single market, and we will not let intolerance, division and fear win.
For Zac Goldsmith, a second political humiliation in a year. Beaten to be London Mayor by Labour, beaten in his own backyard by the Liberal Democrats.
This by-election that we've just had was not a political calculation. It was a promise that I made, and it was a promise that I kept.
Yes, this was just one by-election, but it matters. The government's majority was already slender. This morning, it's thinner still. Chris Mason, BBC News in southwest London.
Let's go to our political correspondent, Eleanor Garnier, who is in the constituency. How much does this matter, Eleanor? How much of an upset is it?
It is a huge upset and really a stunning victory for the Liberal Democrats, who managed to overturn what really was a huge majority. 23,000 votes. They took the seat away from the former Conservative MP, Zac Goldsmith. And now the new MP here is a lady called Sarah Olney. She's an accountant. She wasn't involved in politics or even a member of the party 18 months ago. And now she becomes the Liberal Democrats' 9th MP in the House of Commons. Zac Goldsmith had hoped to fight this by-election on a referendum on expanding Heathrow Airport, but the Liberal Democrats, like Mr Goldsmith, oppose expanding Heathrow. So they fought the campaign on the issue of Brexit, and significantly 70% of people voted Remain here in the referendum in June. Zac Goldsmith, well, he campaigned for Leave. The Liberal Democrats are unashamedly pro-European, and they exploited that ruthlessly. And in the end, I think that's what did it for the party. Of course, this is the second political embarrassment for Zac Goldsmith this year, beaten in the mayoral campaign by Labour, now in his own backyard by the Liberal Democrats. And what it means, of course, for the government and Theresa May, well, she has an even slimmer majority.
Thank you very much, Eleanor, and we will have more reaction to that by-election result right after the rest of the news. Now, overturning a majority of more than 23,000 is no mean feat, even in a by-election. But voters in Richmond Park in southwest London were clearly in an angry mood. The incumbent MP, Zac Goldsmith, had quit the Conservative Party and his seat in the House of Commons to fight a contest on the issue of a third runway at Heathrow. But the Liberal Democrat, Sarah Olney, was determined to shift the battle onto the issue of Brexit. Mr Goldsmith is a Leave supporter, and with a large proportion of his constituents having voted Remain in June's referendum, it seems that Brexit was still foremost in the minds of many. Well, Sarah Olney joined the Liberal Democrats just 18 months ago. She told our political correspondent Chris Mason that the Brexit referendum results spurred her to stand for Parliament.
I think what it will do is it will send a real shockwave through Downing Street. You know, Theresa May is now losing votes and losing a seat, a previously very, very safe seat for her, and it's very clear that the issue is Brexit.
And despite the will of the British people, you'll vote against triggering Article 50?
Well, I've been given my own personal mandate tonight from the voters of Richmond Park and North Kingston.
So you'll ignore the view of the British people?
I will be reflecting the views of my constituency.
The new MP, Sarah Olney. Well, after his defeat was announced, Zac Goldsmith said that causing the by-election in response to the government's green light for a third Heathrow runway was a promise that he had made to his constituents, and he kept it.
Do you regret resigning?
It's not a calculation, is it? I don't regret keeping my promise.
But it's all gone horribly wrong. What went wrong for you in the campaign?
I lost the vote, that's all wrong.
Why do you think it was? Because
He doesn't want to talk to you, man. He doesn't want to talk to you, okay? Give the guy a break. Please.
It's the second electoral blow for Zac Goldsmith this year, following his defeat to Labour's Sadiq Khan in the contest to be London's mayor. And it marks his exit from politics, at least for now. Before the mayoral election, our political guru Norman Smith took him for a spin around the capital in a black cab to test his local knowledge.
Who plays at Loftus Road?
Oh, I don't know.
No?
What's the answer?
Queen's Park Rangers.
Queen's Park Rangers.
Well, let me give you another one.
Yes, go ahead.
Do you use the tube?
Yeah, well, often.
Okay, well, let's take the Central line.
Yeah.
What's next in this sequence? Bond Street, Oxford Circus, Tottenham Court Road.
But I'm going to stop you there because I don't. Most people have a route. I have two routes.
I accept that.
I want to answer this point. Most people have a route or two routes, and they become like an extension of the body, and you use those routes not for ethical reasons, but because it is the only way to get around London without being late for meetings. But for routes outside of the norm, you have apps like City Mapper, which I rely very heavily on pretty much every day, and they ensure that you get where you need to get to on time.
Try this one. Who was the first landlord at the Queen Vic?
In EastEnders?
Yeah.
The first landlord.
Famous.
The first landlord. You were talking 40 years ago, 50 years ago.
Yeah, first landlord, big sort of iconic land.
Dirty Den.
Dirty Den.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, there we go. You see, I'm just.
Where is the Museum of London?
Museum of London Where is the Museum of London? Museum of London. I went there very, very recently. I can't tell you I can't tell you the road it's on.
It's by the Barbican.
Right, absolutely, in the city of London.
Yeah.
Zac Goldsmith no longer an MP. The new MP is LibDem Sarah Olney. We can talk to one of her new colleagues in Parliament, the Lib Dem Tom Brake, who represents the nearby constituency of Carshalton and Wallington and is the party's foreign affairs spokesman. Also, we're joined by the polling expert John Curtis, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University. Thank you both very much for joining us. Tom Brake, is this result really a surprise in a constituency where 70% of people voted for Remain, that the result would have gone this way in the election, in this by-election?
Yes, I think it is a surprise because, first of all, Zac Goldsmith was sitting on a majority of 23,000. And our national opinion poll ratings at the moment are not particularly hot. And he was a popular local MP. So, yes, I think it was a surprise. And what we managed to do during the course of the election, obviously, is to turn it into a referendum on Brexit, where obviously Zac was a very prominent Brexit supporter. And Sarah Olney has made her position very clear in terms of wanting us to remain.
But that's the point exactly, isn't it? The fact that Zac Goldsmith made clear that he was for Brexit, his constituents aren't, when he's up against somebody who is representing the same position as him on Heathrow, which was the reason that this by-election was triggered, wasn't it inevitable that the voters would go for somebody who is echoing what they want to see on Brexit?
Well, I mean, if that was the priority issue for them, and clearly I think the voters of Richmond Park have said that they don't want the Conservative hard Brexit the government seem to be leading us down. It is, again, worth remembering, of course, that Zac Goldsmith wasn't actually opposed by either a Conservative or UKIP candidate either, so he had a clear run of it. And I'm very pleased that Sarah Olney, who is an absolutely brilliant candidate, is now going to be joining me in London.
52% of the country voted for Brexit. Richmond was one of the areas did not. Fundamentally, nothing has changed, has it?
I think fundamentally something very significant has happened, and that is that people have voted to, in very, very clear terms in Richmond Park, for, I think, the closest possible relationship with the European Union. And that is a message which I hope our Prime Minister will be listening to. And it seems as though perhaps some in her cabinet are starting to respond to that. I mean, as we've heard, that Boris Johnson has been going round and telling foreign ambassadors that he believes in freedom of movement. And we've heard from David Davis that he thinks the UK might make a contribution to the European Union budget. So it does look as though perhaps the governments are starting to shift onto our ground.
John Curtis, what do you read into this result? Do you think it's a fundamental change?
Well, this is certainly a by-election that was held in very propitious circumstances for the Liberal Democrats. It's not just a constituency where probably over 70% of people voted to remain in June, but it's also a constituency that continuously from 1979, as long ago as 1979, through to 2010, saw the Liberal Democrats get 40% or more of the vote. The truth is, if the Liberal Democrats could have chosen any constituency in the country in which to fight a by-election at the moment, that Richmond would almost undoubtedly be on top of the list. Now, that said, however, the crucial thing about this result is that since 2010, the Liberal Democrats have been unable to turn propitious circumstances like Richmond into by-election success. And of course, eventually in 2015, they suffered the meltdown in the general election. What I think we see emerging out of this by-election, which frankly, there was also clear evidence of this in Witney, there's also been clear evidence of this in quite a few local government by-elections, is that at least the Liberal Democrats are beginning to regain the mantle of the protest party of by-elections, which of course was always their particular forte. Now, there's still a long way for them to go. As Tom Brake's admitted, they're still only at 8% in the opinion polls. But what they must now be hoping is that, because indeed, Tom Brake is on your programme this morning, that's one benefit to them of this by-election victory, that because the party may now begin to get some publicity and some visibility in much the same way as their success, unexpected success in the Eastbourne by-election of 1990, enabled the party then to turn around what were also dire figures in the opinion polls in the wake of the row of the merger between the then Liberal Party and the SDP.
Just very briefly,
they now have to hope that this by-election has the same kind of impact.
Sorry to interrupt, John. I'm just wondering what you think this might do to the nature of the debate on Brexit and the way MPs might respond, because there's now a new MP in Richmond who says she has a very clear mandate to speak out against Brexit and she will vote against triggering Article 50. Until now, the mood in the Commons seems to have been, even amongst MPs who voted Remain, that they would reflect the national mood. 52%, of course, voted to leave.
Well, given that about 70% of Labour MPs find themselves in the opposite position, that is, they were in favour of remaining, but a majority of their constituents vote to leave, I frankly don't think that this by-election is going to make that much difference, certainly in the short term, to the progress of Brexit. What I think the by-election does show, however, and it's perhaps a warning to all political parties, is potentially how disruptive this Brexit process is going to be for the regular patterns of party politics. It is frankly looks as though it's given the Liberal Democrats an opportunity to appeal to a particular niche market, which are those Remain voters who are so upset that they now wish to see if we can reverse the decision. Now, that's only around a quarter of the electorate. But if the Liberal Democrats can start to appeal successfully to a quarter of the electorate, that will mean they'll begin to gain once more to become electorally relevant. And that, to that extent at least, it's probably the impact of Brexit on our domestic party politics that's why this by-election matters, rather than the impact of this by-election on the Brexit process.
John Curtis, Tom Brake, thank you very much. Now back to the fallout from the Richmond Park by-election, where the Liberal Democrats ousted the former Conservative MP Zac Goldsmith, who had resigned the seat and was standing as an independent in response to the government backing a third runway at Heathrow. Well, in a constituency where almost 70% of voters backed Remain in the EU referendum, it appears the Brexit factor was still foremost in the minds of many. Zac Goldsmith had a majority of more than 23,000 in last year's general election, but supported leave in the referendum. It was a political and personal victory for the Liberal Democrats' Sarah Olney, who joined the party just 18 months ago. We've been talking to some voters on the streets of Richmond this morning.
I voted for the Lib Dems. I voted for Zac last time, but I thought, give them a chance.
Why was that? Because of Brexit? Or?
Yes, and I know I don't support banning the Heathrow. I think it's good for the economy. I know they both did, but for me, It was probably the Brexit, yes.
From working here and speaking to everyone, there's a lot of mixed opinions. Yeah, especially Zach Goldsmith.
What's the opinion on Zach Goldsmith then here? What do you hear about him?
Everyone just feels like he sort of let the team down. Everyone's usually like let the side down a bit.
I'm not surprised, although I was disappointed that it was fought on a Brexit issue and rather than a local political issue. Yeah, so I find that quite disappointing, and I find it quite disappointing that only 53% of the electorate voted.
We can speak now to the Conservative MP Sibylle Cash, who was a prominent Leave campaigner and chairman of the European Scrutiny Committee of MPs. Thank you very much for joining us. Well, Zach Goldsmith was standing as an independent. No Conservative was put up against him. He was, of course, a Tory MP before, and this was a Conservative safe seat. So is this effectively a defeat for the Tory party?
Well, no, and I'd just like to say Zach behaved very honourably, and I think everyone accepts that, including the Liberal Democrats. No, the position basically is that it was an enormously Remain area. I think it was 72% in the referendum, and it's not very surprising, actually, given the circumstances, that this might have happened. The reality, however, is that it was not the Conservatives versus the Liberal Democrats. He stood as an independent. The Heathrow issue had gone against him, and a lot of people may have thought, although I think it was very unfair to suggest that he'd let them down, actually he did the right thing by saying that he was going to stand as an independent in these circumstances. He kept to his word.
So what is the significance of this result for you? Because, I mean, people will always say, well, a by-election is a chance to give a kicking to the sitting government, whatever. The Liberal Democrats say the message is clear: people do not want a hard Brexit.
I'm afraid that is just rubbish. If you go to my constituency, it was 65% to leave. If you go to Stoke-on-Trent, I think it was well over 70% to leave. The fact is that there are different parts of the country that have different approaches to this subject. I think that the argument now has to come back to the question of the merits of the Brexit issue, and that is going to be something which we can demonstrate. There was no Armageddon. The fact is the investment is up, exports are up, the FTSE is up, the consumer index is up. The reality is that it's working extremely well in terms of the economy, none of the Armageddon, and the bottom line is this, that we have to get on the front foot on that, bring the argument back to the question of what kind of country do you want to be in terms of who governs you, and the bottom line on that is that the reason why it's so important that we stick very strongly to the principle that was established with the vote that took place in the referendum is it's about who governs Britain. If you look at Europe, they're dysfunctional. The fact is it doesn't work. If you look at the rise of the far right, which is going on in this vacuum that the European Union's created, the instability of it.
Everybody is obviously interpreting in whichever way they sort of choose from their personal perspective what the signals are from the people about what is wanted in terms of Brexit. I just wonder what you think, though, quickly, on David Davis now talking about a softer approach. Are you surprised to hear him talking about that, and do you think that indicates the government will go more for soft Brexit?
I know David Davis extremely well. I talk to him several times a week, and I absolutely can assure you he is not soft on Brexit. The reality is that this is about what kind of country we have. Do we govern ourselves according to the will of the British people? Do we want our parliament to actually reflect the manner in which we're governed? And the short answer to that is that we got a huge vote, over 17 million, and that remains on the table. And there won't be a second referendum, and the Liberal Democrats may have their day on this, but I've seen by-elections, for example, in Mid-Staffordshire, which is what I represent now. When John Heddle died, we had a 23% swing against the Conservatives. This was only against independents, and we got the seat back, and I'm still there with a majority of 16,000.
Bill Cash, thank you very much. Well, let's bring in the former Liberal Democrat leader, Lord Ashdown, who is in Somerset. Bill Cash there saying, Paddy Ashdown, the Liberal Democrats have had their day, but this is just a by-election.
Yeah. Victoria, you know, one of the sort of moments of national pleasure after by-elections is watching the politicians who lost squirm and making different excuses for it. And Bill Cash is a master. I know, by the way, I've been there myself on difficult days. He's a master at trying to look. A number of facts. First of all, he stood as an independent, but everybody knew it was a complete false independent. I mean, Tory MPs flooded out of Westminster to go and campaign for him. UKIP stood down for him. They threw the kitchen sink at this, and they lost. Now listen, I've been there, done that, got the T-shirt. It's pretty tough when you do, but to say that none of this means anything, I think is just sort of rude and insulting to the electorate of Richmond.
But in the end, sorry, is it a surprise that in a constituency where the sitting MP voted out, the popular view was to remain, more than 70%, when that sitting MP is standing against a Liberal Democrat candidate who had exactly the same perspective on Heathrow expansion, which was the reason why this by-election was triggered, but the difference was that she is in favour of Remain. Is it any surprise the Lib Dems won then?
Victoria, I'll bet you couldn't have found me a single commentator in Westminster who knew anything about this, who thought we would win last week. Yes, it was a huge surprise. Listen to the BBC today. Look, I'm not going to overplay this, Victoria, because you shouldn't a by-election, because a by-election, and this is where I think Bill is right, a by-election is a sort of snapshot. It doesn't tell you what's going to happen, but it tells you what is happening. And I think the people of the country, including probably many of those who voted Brexit, are now feeling the real pain of this. I think our party and our candidate was outstanding. He's going to make a very good MP. I think it's a tremendous success for Lib Dems. You can't doubt that. I don't think anybody would, coming from the sort of road crash of the last election, and by the way, for our leader as well. And I think it really does show the government that this headlong rush towards a hard Brexit that will cost a huge amount of jobs in Britain isn't the right way the country to go. Now, of course, the Tories are open to say, we're not going to pay any attention, we're going to turn our back on this. I thought they were supposed to be following the will of the people. It is an important...
But the will of the people was 52% voted for Brexit.
It was, but I think, you know, even you can hear it in Bill Cash's voice, and you can hear it, by the way, the government is in complete chaos. I've never known a government so muddled over a policy. It begins to feel also that the people of Britain are now feeling the effects of the decision they took.
Paddy Ashdown, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us, Paddy Ashdown. Thank you.
Well, Tim Farron claims last night's by-election victory puts the Lib Dems back in the big time. The party's candidate in Richmond, Sarah Orney, overturned Zach Goldsmith's 23,000 majority, winning just over 20,500 votes to Mr Goldsmith's 18,638. Labour's Christian Walmer came a distant third, with just over 1,500 votes, and lost his deposit. The Conservatives UK and the Green Party did not stand a candidate in this election. What's the significance of this, do you think, Zoe?
I think it's two things. I think it does have a Brexit significance. I think he was punished by the constituents. I think you've got a figure of 70%. I heard 80% were Remainers in Richmond. I mean, extraordinary.
If you take the Richmond area and the Kingston area, because we saw how they voted in the referendum, these are the units that voted, it's about 70.
Okay, but I think the other thing is his kind of dirty...
Anyway, it's high.
Yeah, it's really high. The other thing is his dirty mayoral campaign. I don't think people have forgotten what that was like, and I think, you know, he's got a very urbane, sophisticated constituency, and I don't think they like to have people with Indian surnames targeted with specific mail shots, and kind of frankly racist insinuations about Sadiq Khan. I don't think people liked it.
So you think it was an anti-Goldsmith?
I think it was definitely an anti-Goldsmith vote. I mean, if you look at those numbers, the swing away from him is extraordinary.
How do you read it, Sam?
Well, I think that the numbers are phenomenal. To overturn 23,000 majority means that definitely there is a big political shift, and there are two significant things I think that flow from it. The first thing is that, you know, we now have the first MP who will claim, and it'll be contested, but who will claim some kind of anti-Brexit mandate in what she does now in Parliament.
She has claimed that. She claimed that to me at 3 o'clock this morning.
Absolutely, and that means that she has pledged to behave in a certain way when it comes to trying to stop Article 50. And the second big significance is that this was one with the Liberal Democrats heading an absolutely fascinating sort of progressive alliance that was made up of the Greens, it was obviously made up of Liberal Democrats, and even the odd Tory. You saw how Anna Soubry this morning was irritated her own colleagues by coming out and praising the election.
She is a bit of a Tory outlier, though.
She is a Tory outlier.
But also,
but I think that there is just this interesting question and I think it's too early to say anything definitive, whether or not British politics is starting just to slightly realign along the lines that we saw in the referendum, rather than on sticking by narrow party definitions. And if that happens, I'm not so sure that's that good for everybody on the Remain side of the argument, because there were more constituencies that voted for Leave, and Northern Labour seats could be in trouble.
But also, I think, to continue that point, Labour did have a conversation internally about whether or not to stand aside as well, and decided not to. And that is a tension that's going to happen with the Progressive Alliance increasingly, that they're going to say up to the point where you field the candidates, yes, we should ally, and then go, oh no, we're going to stick this candidate.
Because we still have to run.
Yeah.
And much good did it do them?
No, exactly.
The result came just after 2 o'clock this morning. Live from this very studio, we carried it. Here's the moment that Sarah Olney of the Lib Dems was declared the winner.
I hereby declare that the said Sarah Jane Olney is duly elected as Member of Parliament for the Richmond Park constituency.
The people of Richmond Park and North Kingston have sent a shockwave through this Conservative Brexit government, and our message is clear. We do not want a hard Brexit. We do not want to be pulled out of the single market, and we will not let intolerance, division and fear win. Thank you very much.
And we're joined now by the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Tim Farron. Welcome back to the programme. Now, the Lib Dems were the only major party to contest this election. The Tories didn't have a candidate. Labour stood in name only. This was a referendum on Zac Goldsmith. That's it.
No, I don't think so. It felt to me that it was what the electorate chose it was going to be. I think it's possible that Zac's mayoral campaign prized away a few of his supporters, but I think broadly speaking, it was about Brexit. It was about
which
the
he was
direction
in
of the country.
favour, and his constituency was against.
But what was very interesting as well, we think a third. And you know, we can say this on this programme because people do look at the details. The Liberal Democrat canvass figures turn out to be the most accurate polling around. So we're opening for hire. Anybody who wants some accurate polling doing, come
Too late
to
for
us.
Hillary Clinton.
But we were spot on, it would appear, with our figures.
Right.
And if you then look below that, nearly a third of Conservative voting in the past, Leave voters voted Liberal Democrat. And at a picture that happened in Witney as well. So the idea that this is just Remain versus Leave is not so. That's not anecdotally so. I don't think the figures stack up for that.
But in the end,
So
a strongly
people who wanted
Remain constituency voted for the Remain candidate.
Yes, but I think that the number of people, well, I think overturning a 23,000 majority counts as a shock under any circumstances.
Oh, I think the result is dramatic. There's no question about that.
I think that, so there are many by-election results in terms of council seats since June the 23rd. 23 of them Liberal Democrat gains, 13 of them were in Leave areas. And like I say, hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of Tories who voted Leave in June voted for Sarah Olney, the Liberal Democrats, yesterday.
Sarah Olney told me in the small hours of this morning that she will vote against Article 50 when it comes to the Commons, even if the government promises a second referendum. Is that party policy?
Well, she's made a specific promise to her electorate, and she has a unique position.
Is
she
it
has
party
a mandate.
policy?
No, my view is that we have a red line, which is that there should be a referendum on the terms of the deal. If the government were to accept that, then yes, we'd vote for Article 50. If they don't, we would vote against it. But Sarah's in a very peculiar position. She is somebody who's got her mandate on the basis of saying she voted against Article 50 since the referendum. I think she's in a very special position.
What is the logic
that's good.
of voting against Article 50? If the country voted as it did on June the 23rd, and if, I doubt it will happen, but if the government promises you a second referendum, on what possible basis could you vote against Article 50?
Well, this is a constituency where people keeping their word is clearly very important, and Sarah made that promise to her electorate.
What's the democratic logic of it?
And my sense is that the referendum on the terms of the deal is becoming increasingly logical as the only way out of it.
Yeah, but that's not what I'm asking. What I'm saying is Sarah Olney's position, because it seems she's already breaking party policy. If given the way we voted on June the 23rd, and if the government was to say we'll have a second referendum on the terms, what is the democratic case for voting against Article 50?
Well, there are two MPs in a peculiar and unique, well, not position, but there are two people in a unique position, if you can have two people in a unique position. Robert Courts, of course, from Witney, who is a Leaver, and Sarah Olney from Richmond Park, who is a Remainer, who have had their mandates since the referendum, which I think overturns any mandate they may have had in the other direction.
So 20,000 votes in Richmond Park is a stronger mandate than 17.4 million votes to leave.
In the end, we're constituency MPs and we represent the people who put us there. And this was a referendum, it felt in many ways, on the government's treatment and direction over Brexit. And like I say, a vast number of people who had voted Leave in Richmond in June voted Liberal Democrat yesterday because they believe that Theresa May is taking a hard line on Brexit that most people who voted Leave
You keep on going on and on about hard Brexit. What's hard Brexit?
Well, I guess you could talk about all sorts of things, but in particular,
you talk about hard Brexit.
The most obvious thing is whether we are in or out of the single market, and I think that is the definer for most people.
But during the referendum campaign, George Osborne, David Cameron, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, they all made it clear that if we vote to leave, we vote to leave as members of the single market. That was never in doubt.
I think it was always in doubt. And Dan Hannan, for example, often made the case that we would and should stay in the single market.
No, he said we should have full access to the single market. That's not the same as membership. David Cameron said if we vote to leave the EU, we vote to leave membership of the single market. That was not in doubt.
There's a by-election this time next week in Sleaford, in Lincolnshire, a place that voted Leave overall, whose MP, Stephen Phillips, voted Leave and believes, and one of the reasons he resigned from the Conservative Party, or rather from Parliament, was because he believes that whilst he voted Leave, he did not vote for us to leave the single market. Now, my anecdotal evidence throughout Whitney...
What do you mean by leave the single market?
To be a member of the single market. North Korea's got access to the single market.
Yeah.
Membership of the single market is what gets us access to the single rule book that cuts red tape and makes sure that we have that
basically, for you, you want a deal which effectively keeps us in the European Union. I mean, you go on and on saying you respect the result of June the 23rd, but you don't. You want us to remain member of the single market, which means we'd have to be subject to the full free movement of peoples, exactly as it is now, and be subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. In other words, nothing changes.
Well, that all depends on what our government can negotiate as a consequence. I'm saying this is what I would argue for. And what the British people...
So what's the change from now?
What the British people want is up to them. We have had no indication as to what destination the United Kingdom...
But hard Brexit is just... It's a propaganda phrase by you. Hard Brexit just means what the people voted for. The people voted to end free movement of people. They voted not to be members of the single market, but still to have free trade. And they voted for the courts. Well, listen, I interviewed these people. They told me again and again. They said...
You haven't interviewed all 17 million of them.
No, I interviewed the people running the campaign.
I've spoken to
Are you in any doubt that the Leave campaign wanted to get out of the jurisdiction of the European Court?
Well, ask them. Ask the 17.5 million people who voted Leave for different reasons. And in the end, what we discovered yesterday in Richmond Park, what we discovered in Witney a few weeks ago, is that there are millions of people. Stephen Phillips, former Conservative MP, is
you mentioned
the example of millions of others who voted to Leave. I totally respect that, and voted or believed.
No, you've mentioned him. Stick with the issues, because it's your position. It's your position I'm here to interrogate, not Mr. Phillips.
But you're making all sorts of assumptions that you know how
I'm not.
Voted
I'm not. And don't misrepresent me. What I'm saying is the people who ran the Leave campaign I interviewed, and they were clear that we could no longer be members of the single market. They wanted to end freedom of movement.
Where was the manifesto?
They wanted the European Court no longer to have jurisdiction. They said it again and again.
Where was the Leave manifesto?
You don't want any of that to happen.
I mean, I take the view that Britain is not going to get a better deal outside the European Union it's got in it. But that should be up to the British people. It's not up for me or Boris Johnson or Theresa May to tell the British people what deal they should have to live with at the end.
But you're effectively arguing that nothing should change.
Andrew, we've heard this week from Boris Johnson and from others that there's potentially going to be significant freedom of movement. How do you're saying the people on the Leave side of those 17 million people that they voted against freedom of movement?
But they voted to control.
Will that not be a betrayal of those people who voted to leave on that basis? Or have you not spoken to all of the 17 million people?
No, you made that point twice, and I've answered it to you. But what would change in your Brexit? What would the difference be?
Well, I'm going to argue, obviously, that Britain is better off in the European Union.
So you want to stay?
But in the referendum on the terms of the deal, which is the only logical and democratic way out of this to get actual closure, so you don't have 75% of the electorate thinking they've got something that they voted against, in that referendum, we would have the deal that the government managed to achieve on the ballot paper with a vote to remain in the EU as the default option. Now, I cannot see any circumstances in which I'm going to be convinced that any deal to leave the EU is better than what we've got now.
So you would vote to remain?
But I think there'll be many people out there who, if the government comes up with a good enough deal, will accept that.
But how could the government...
Unlike the Scottish referendum, where, to be fair to the Yes campaign, Alex Salmond and so on, where there was a manifesto and a clear idea of what a yes vote would have meant, there was a blank piece of paper. Well, that is their choice, but as a consequence, the British people voted for departure and not destination.
Well, there wasn't a clear one because in the Scottish referendum, because we had no idea whether in the end Scotland would be allowed to use sterling or not, which was the single biggest issue. So that's actually not accurate.
There was a manifesto we could interrogate.
Let me ask you this. If we say we'll have a vote on the terms, and we're negotiating with the European Union that wants us to stay, why would they give us a decent deal? They would give us as bad a deal as possible, so people like you will say, look, it's a terrible deal, you have to vote against it.
Be a big risk, that, wouldn't it, really, in both directions. But in the end, I can't speak for EU negotiators. I can speak as a parliamentarian trying to make sure that our government gets the best deal possible for
but confront the logic of what I just put to you. The EU wants us to stay. They're terrified of us leaving in case it sparks others to leave as well, a rush to the door. So you're now saying there'll have to be a vote on the deal itself. So it's clearly logical that the European leaders will say, right, give them as bad a deal as possible so they vote against it.
I mean, you've highlighted the fact that we are in choppy waters and there isn't a perfect way out of all this, but the least perfect way out of all this is that you have a deal that, let's say, the 48% don't like and half of the 52% think is a betrayal of what they voted for. That is far worse. What we then end up then is a lack of consent for what goes next, a complete undermining of people's faith in democracy.
Could you confront the point that I've put to you? What incentive, if we're having a second referendum, would the European Union have to give us any kind of deal that was good?
So if you talk to, as I do, the leaders of other European countries, 7 leaders of the other 27 countries are Liberals, talking to them, they are not without similar pressures domestically to us. The fact that there could be some change in movement, freedom of movement or other things, these potentially could happen. I think that the European Union may, for all that I think what's happened over Brexit is regrettable, I respect the result, it may...
You don't respect the result, though, do you?
Of course I do. I mean, as a Liberal Democrat, I lose elections sometimes.
You want to stay in the single market, you want no controls on freedom of movement, and you want the European Court continue to be the ultimate jurisdiction. In what sense do you respect the result?
Since when you lose an election, do you have to give up your principles and change what you think? I mean, Tom Watson and people in the Labour Party may be waving the white flag. I'm prepared to fight our corner, and that is a risk, but it's the right thing for our country.
You want to reverse the result.
What I'm wanting to make the point here is that there are people elsewhere in the European Union who I think are prepared to change quite significantly as a consequence of Britain's result. Now, that, in one sense, might be proving me wrong from the referendum campaign that happened 6 months ago. The British people might actually, through their vote, have achieved a better Europe as a consequence of all this. But it's not going to happen.
Sounds a stretch,
if the British people don't get their say. I have to say...
What do you make of the Lib Dem position?
I think that Tim is going to dig in to where he is. I mean, I think that there is a constituency that he is trying to maximise the votes from that believe exactly as he said, that essentially they want to reverse the result and find any mechanism to do so. And I think that it will get them above the 9 MPs that they have at the moment. I don't quite know where the ceiling is. I don't know how far you can push it, but it's definitely a electorally, tactically smart thing to do in an environment where the Labour Party is effectively silent on Brexit. They seem to have a kind of conservative mindless position where they're not going to do anything material to change the outcome of an Article 50 vote or the Great Repeal Bill. So in an environment where you're looking for differentiation, I think Tim's whole strategy is to give you the answers you don't want to hear.
That's the key, isn't it? There's a distinctive Lib Dem position now.
There is a distinctive Lib Dem position, but I don't quite agree on the Labour Party. The actual thinking there is don't campaign against Brexit. Brexit is happening. Campaign against but campaign for the Brexit that you want. So don't just concentrate on things that you don't want. Think about how things could actually be better. And certainly Keir Starmer has been quite clear on this. He's been really trying to draw out a different way of doing things so that you get a Brexit that isn't just not a disaster, but actually reflects different.
That would work if they could agree what that was, but they can't.
It would work if they were actually saying it more loudly. I mean, I agree with you. They need to amplify it.
It's possible that there was something else going on in Richmond Park and in Witney and in other places as well that was actually at least as important as Brexit, which was this general sense that there desperately needs to be a decent, moderate, progressive opposition.
Yeah.
We'll be landed with a Tory government for the next quarter of a century unless there is one, and the Labour Party clearly have no interest in being that, and we can be.
Okay.
I'll leave it there, Tim Farron. Thanks. It's been a busy night for you.
It has.
Now, Zach Goldsmith triggered the by-election by resigning from Parliament over the government's decision to back a third runway at Heathrow, something he'd always promised to do, though he fought the 2010 and the 2015 general elections on the same platform. Speaking at the count this morning, he said he'd miss being the MP for Richmond Park.
This by-election that we've just had was not a political calculation. It was a promise that I made, and it was a promise that I kept. It has been a huge, huge, huge privilege to serve and represent this community over the last 6 years, and I will miss doing it. This is my community. I grew up here. I live here. I love this community.
And we've been joined by the Conservative MP, Minister for London, Gavin Barwell. Welcome to the programme. How did you manage to lose a by-election in which you didn't even have a candidate?
Well, clearly we didn't field a candidate, as you say. I'm sorry for Zach. I think he'd been a good MP for Richmond Park. I think you can see from the result he got at the general election that he had been well respected locally, but not that surprising result given the circumstances.
It's a bit of self-indulgence, which has now backfired in your party.
Well, clearly we didn't agree with his decision to call the by-election, but he said beforehand that that's what he would do, and I suppose you have to respect him for keeping his word.
Your majority is now down to 10, not very big. You're divided over Europe. We still have no clear idea of what Brexit means, despite the Prime Minister's reiteration of the tautology. And there's 3.5 years to run. It's all beginning to smell a little bit like John Major in the early 90s, isn't it?
Not at all. I think if you look at there's a clear difference with the 1990s. You look at the opinion polls at the moment, it's very clear. The Prime Minister is in a very, very strong position.
Except that you are divided on this issue, and you've left a vacuum. We don't really know what it is you're after, and others, including now Sarah Olney and the LibDems, they're filling that vacuum.
Well, I don't think we are divided on this issue. Clearly the party was on different sides during the referendum campaign, but what you've seen from Tim Farron just now is a clear indication, as you said, that he wants to overturn the result, whereas I think the vast majority of Conservative MPs believe that we have to respect the decision that the whole country took on the 23rd of June.
There was a 21% swing, in effect, against the Conservatives, even though Mr Goldsmith fought as an independent in Richmond. 6 weeks ago, there was a 19% swing against you in the Prime Minister's old constituency. You could begin to see the start of a trend here.
Well, I don't think that's the case, Andrew. I think if you look at the two particular by-elections, in the first one in Witney, the former Prime Minister had defended that seat at the last general election. It's not surprising there was quite a different result with the
19% swing?
And in the second one, there were clearly the Richmond Park constituency was one of the parts of the country that had voted heaviest for Remain in the referendum. So I think if you look at the opinion polls and you look at the performance in local government by-elections, you can see that under Theresa May, the Conservative Party continues to perform extremely strongly.
Well, that's a very good point, isn't it? Because we always talk about the Conservative Party now as though they're all pro-Brexit, and we forget a huge, huge body of Conservatives who were always Remain and weren't in favour of the referendum to begin with. And that, it looks like a strong position because you've got obviously stronger leadership than the Labour Party, and they don't say very much. But there is a kind of festering problem that if the Conservative Party is drawing its strength from certainty and directionality on Brexit, and half of them never wanted it in the first place, it's a bit of a patterner.
We live in a democracy. I campaigned for Remain.
Yeah.
And I think you have to respect the turnout in that referendum. The number of people that voted for Brexit is higher than the number of people that voted for any government.
I know, but it wasn't
that
much higher. You say the whole country voted to leave. The whole country didn't vote to leave.
Your area, Croydon, which covers a part of your constituency, also voted to Remain. And your reaction to that at 10 minutes past 7 on June the 24th, was proud that my hometown and the great city of which it is part rejected the politics of hate and division yesterday.
So that was a comment on Nigel Farage and some of the things that he had done during the campaign, and that's how I still feel today.
He didn't run the Leave campaign. Your fellow Conservatives ran the Leave campaign.
He played a prominent part. He may
not as
not be involved
prominent
in the official
as
vote
Mr. Gove
Leave
or
campaign.
Mr. Johnson, so they were part of hate and division.
No, I certainly don't think that in terms of Michael Gove or Boris Johnson. I was commenting on the way that Nigel Farage and some of the people around him behaved.
Your tweet doesn't mention Nigel Farage.
Well, it was part of a sequence of tweets replying to this.
Oh, really?
But look, the point is that the country made a decision. Whatever my views in relation to what I wanted, how I wanted people to vote on the 23rd, I think politicians have to accept the result. And what we now need to do is come together as a country and understand the reasons why people voted for Leave, deliver those changes, but also get the best deal that we can for the country in terms of trade and in terms of working with our European nations on
your
climate
tweet
security.
On the morning of the day after is in line with what Anna Soubry tweeted today, describing the LibDem victory in Richmond Park as, quote, sensational and, quote, common sense is winning. Do you agree with that?
I think common sense is winning in the sense that the government is respecting the result that the people declared on the 23rd of June.
No, she meant common sense is winning because somebody who was against leaving had won the Richmond Park by-election.
Well, I don't think that's a view that the majority of Conservative MPs would share, or indeed the majority of people watching this. I don't agree with that. No, I think the right thing, as I've said several times, the right thing for the government to do is to respect the result that the British people gave us to get the best possible deal.
No, you've said that. But how can this country come together in any way until it knows what you propose on breakfast? On Brexit. Or even breakfast. I mean, I would propose for breakfast bacon and eggs. I'm not sure. Zoe, what was it, muesli? Just to play with the... I'm not sure what the Times is. Probably croissant, do you think? Let's get back to Brexit. Yeah. How can the country come together in any way until we know what it is you're after?
Well, the Prime Minister has spelt out a couple of clear things that we're trying to achieve, which is to make sure that we get control of our borders and to make sure that we make our own laws and to get the best possible trading relationship we can. We talked about this when I was on the show 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Did we?
She's been very clear about why it's not in the national interest to spell out the detail of our negotiating strategy.
So we can't come together then, because so for her own negotiating tactics, the country can't in any way come together. Sam Coates.
I get very confused where we are on Brexit, because just this week it seems like Britain is going to continue to be part of the European Court of Justice through the patent court system. It looks as if we're going to be paying money into the European coffers, and it looks from David Davis's comments to the CBI in Wales last night as if they want to make sure that key skills, every sector gets key skills, and Cabinet Ministers say that could include, for instance, low-skilled workers coming and working on farms. So if you're not going to use the Brexit vote to clamp down on low-skilled migration, stop payments to the European Union, and to end the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, all those things that the Vote Leave campaign said that we were going to do, isn't the problem with Theresa May?
What's the point?
Then what's the point in what we're doing?
What's the answer?
Well, so the answer to that is on 2 of those issues, the Prime Minister has been very clear what we are going to do, which is we are going to get control of our borders. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't, in certain circumstances, allow people to come here where the needs of our economy mandate that, and we're also very clear that we want to be have control of our own laws.
Can I ask a question about the borders, because this is highly confusing to me. Since intra-EU migration was allowed, then the borders don't really come into it, do they? I mean, we can say we'll clamp down on the borders and that will stop illegal immigration, but the EU is completely irrelevant to that.
No, we're talking about controlling the numbers of people that are able to come into the country.
I know.
And clearly, if you've got freedom of movement, you don't have that control. As the figures.
Well, no, but that's not a border thing, is it? I mean, presumably the border issue, you either say to the EU, we no longer have freedom of movement, which there's no indication that is on the table actually at the moment, or you say EU migration isn't the problem, it's all this illegal migration.
Briefly.
I think it's very clear in terms of how people voted on the 23rd of June that the levels of migration into the country are a concern
that's
for
a
many
very
people,
broad
and you need to be able
point,
to address that.
Well, yeah.
All right, well, it's clearly not going to be addressed this morning. In my experience, when politicians say it's very clear, just mud comes into my eyes. It's about as clear as that most of the time. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew.
He must have thought he wasn't taking much of a risk in resigning as Conservative MP for Richmond Park and standing as an independent to win it back. He had a 23,000 majority and local backing for his opposition to the expansion of Heathrow Airport, and his former party even obligingly decided not to oppose him. But Zac Goldsmith reckoned without the by-election pedigree of the Liberal Democrats and the Brexit backlash. The Lib Dems' Sarah Olney rode the Remainer tide to victory with a majority of almost 2,000, as our political correspondent Michael Crick reports.
Lib Dems at last embracing an election rather than embarrassed by it. A 23,000 majority overturned by Sarah Olney in a campaign transformed from a vote on Heathrow to a vote on Brexit.
I think the people of Richmond Park yesterday voted to send a message to Theresa May that the British people did not vote for a hard Brexit that will damage our economy and future generations and our standing in the world. They voted instead for a country that is open, tolerant and united. They voted for an excellent Member of Parliament who will be a voice for millions.
And now, as an MP, Sarah Olney will vote against triggering Article 50.
So that's the commitment I made in my campaign, and my by-election victory means I've got my, a personal mandate from the voters of Richmond Park that that's what they want me to do.
Do you see your way back into government now?
I see a way back into this country having an option against the Tories that is not the Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party, but a party that can give people hope that there is a...
With 9 MPs?
Who believe... Well, look, 2 years ago, the SNP had 6.
A grim Zach Goldsmith took his defeat early this morning. He'd promised to resign over Heathrow expansion, and it backfired.
This by-election that we've just had was not a political calculation. It was a promise that I made, and it was a promise that I kept.
He went home to rest and left it to neighbours to talk.
I've just come back from yoga. I'm feeling a bit falling apart.
Really?
I'm devastated.
Why do you think it happened?
I think it was because of the Brexit vote. But environmentally, he's the right man to make the call on Heathrow.
In a tweet since deleted, his brother Ben showed rather less grace. Even by Lib Dem standards, he said, Sarah Olney really is unimaginably drab. It's Zach Goldsmith's second election loss in 7 months, having been defeated for London Mayor last May. Some think the negative style of his mayoral campaign may have lost him votes in Richmond too.
I thought he did very badly in the mayoral election, and I think so did a lot of other people.
So it was no longer the blue-eyed boy of Richmond?
I think he was no longer the blue-eyed boy, yes.
Did Sarah Olney win, or did Zach Goldsmith lose?
Oh, he lost big time.
Why?
Well, because he took us for granted. Firstly, he should never, ever have called a by-election. Secondly, if he was an independent, he should have been an independent. OK, the Tory party should have run somebody against him. And thirdly, and this is most important, it's a vanity project for him.
Why do you think Mr. Goldsmith lost?
I think he lost heart.
Then there's Europe, and crucially, Richmond voted 70% Remain last June, and the Lib Dems today hailed this as a vote against a hard Brexit from the EU. One of the lead Brexit negotiators for the European Parliament, Guy Verhofstadt, tweeted today,
"Congratulations, Sarah Olney and Lib Dems. Europe is watching and we are proud."
But the Conservatives didn't stand in Richmond or officially back Goldsmith, and the result makes no difference, say pro-Brexit MPs.
This result occurred in one of the most pro-Remain parts of the United Kingdom. The Liberal Democrats secured fewer than half of the votes overall cast. So, while for Sarah Olney, I wish her well in the future, I think it would be a mistake for her or for anyone else to interpret this as any sort of mandate to frustrate the will of the British people.
Labour's vote crumbled last night as supporters tactically voted Lib Dem. Indeed, Labour's 1,515 votes were fewer than the local party has members, which may never have happened before in a Westminster poll. Richmond Park probably won't change government policy on Brexit. It's cheered those keen to stay in Europe and boost the centre ground of politics, though we may see a rather different story in next week's by-election in Sleaford.
Well, if Richmond is a Remain stronghold, Romford, on the other side of the capital, was very much part of the Leave tide in June. On the morning after the vote, we were there to hear from jubilant market traders who were celebrating victory. Today, our reporter, Porrick O'Brien, went back to Romford Market to hear from those same traders on whether they think Brexit is going so slowly it's in danger of slipping into reverse.
On the morning after the referendum back in June, at Crosby's fishmonger Romford, the flag went up with new energy and purpose.
So you pleased?
Yeah, well pleased. All my family voted Leave.
In this town, it was 2-1, Leavers to Remainers.
It's like the London effect, like it's the haves and the have-nots, you know, and I think people have got the hump of it. I think that's one of the reasons why, like, so many people were voted out.
Back then, rebellion was in the air. It still is today, but for different reasons. How are you feeling about it all since then?
I think it's going too slow. It's about time it's got a finger out and get it sorted. You know, people was going to get the hump about it because at the end of the day, the people have voted, and if you go against the people, it's like civil war, isn't it? If you go against the people, sooner or later, people get the hump and they fight back.
I mean, is it the kind of thing that you would take to the streets over?
Yeah, of course I would.
The people we spoke to don't just want hard Brexit, they want it diamond tipped.
Brexit.
Yes. How are you feeling about the speed that it's going at?
No, not happy.
Why not?
Because it ain't happened. We voted for it to happen, and they need to pull their finger out and get it to happen.
Yeah.
No excuses.
And the people steering the country to exit have a job of work to do in Romford when it comes to managing expectations.
We should be out at the very latest by the end of the next financial year, which is the end of March next year.
Is that really, that's the kind of time scale that you had in mind when you voted to leave?
Yeah, what are we doing now? We're just sitting here doing nothing. Let's get over there, tell them we're off, and let it do.
If you folded a map of London crossways, Romford would land on Richmond. On Brexit, though, different planets.
Well, a little earlier, I spoke to the former Lib Dem leader and the party's current spokesman on Europe, Nick Clegg. I asked him how he felt this latest win would alter Brexit.
I think it sends a sort of shot across the bows, doesn't it, to Theresa May and the government that, you know, it reminds them perhaps, let me put it that way, that on the 23rd of June, yes, the Brexit argument won, but a very large number of people, clearly a very large number of people in Richmond, do not share the direction in which the government is now taking the country. And, you know, at the end of the day, Theresa May is the Prime Minister of the whole country, not just the 52%, not just the Conservatives, not just doing what her hardline, hard Brexiteers on her backbenchers say. And I think in many ways, the biggest message of this by-election of all is to a government that appears to be rushing headlong towards a self-harming, hard version of Brexit. And it might remind them that, in fact, there are many people in the country, not least in Richmond, but elsewhere as well, who want a more sensible Brexit and a softer Brexit, if you like, such that we don't throw the kind of single market baby out with the EU bathwater.
But it was essentially a binary choice, and isn't it the Prime Minister's duty to listen to the majority? The majority voted for Brexit, she's got to get on with it.
Yes, of course she needs to get on with it. The question is, what is it? And as you know, the Brexiteers very effectively, but very cynically in my view, deliberately withheld from the British people any meaningful description about what Brexit actually means in practice. And more than that, they didn't actually publish a sort of a Brexit manifesto in which you had a picture of Gove and Farage and Johnson on the front saying this is our collective view about what Brexit should mean for the United Kingdom. So there are many, many choices to be made. There isn't one version of Brexit. There are lots of different possibilities.
So do you agree then with John Major and Tony Blair that there is this sort of big bulk of people in the middle of British politics at the moment who are not being heard?
Yes, absolutely.
But isn't there then an overwhelming argument for a new political vehicle for those millions of people who, for all sorts of historical reasons, perhaps may not want to become Liberal Democrats, but they don't like politics as it is?
Here's the thing. Even though Theresa May has not been elected as a Prime Minister herself, even though her party only got 24% of the eligible vote, nonetheless, the Conservative Party is pretty well unassailable at the moment because neither the Labour Party, Plaid, the Greens, LibDems, UKIP, none of those parties on their own can wrest power away from the party of government. And that's why I think the Labour Party needs to ask itself very searching questions, not least after last night. If the Labour Party ever wants to wield power again, It has to share power again. And that does perhaps not mean a new party, in fact, almost certainly not. It certainly does mean, however, a different approach to the way in which parties treat each other, particularly those parties who want to mount proper opposition to a Conservative government.
Isn't the other great challenge, though, of British politics right now that there will be people in constituencies around Britain who were very pro-Brexit, who feel let down by Labour and who are moving over to UKIP, and there is a massive gulf between them and you, and I mean you in the sort of, you call yourselves the sort of progressive centre, and that's you, the Greens, and all sorts of other sort of right-wing Labour people.
Well, I think there's a gulf, dare I say it, not just between the list that you read out and many millions of voters. There's a huge gulf across the developed world. Many millions of our fellow citizens, particularly those on low and middle incomes, have been suffering, their families have been suffering, they haven't had a meaningful pay rise for 8 long years and counting, through no fault of their own. It was the fault of the bankers and the politicians and the regulators who were asleep at the wheel, and that has generated, quite understandably, huge anger at the status quo. And I think that is one of the reasons, not the only reasons, that lay behind the Brexit vote on the 23rd of June. It's one of the reasons, not the only reason, that lay behind Trump, and it's one of the reasons, not the only reason, that no doubt will lead to further eruptions in Europe.
Nick Clegg. Well, with me now is Labour Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott, and we're joined from Washington by the Conservative Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Crispin Blunt, who supported Brexit. Diane Abbott, do you see Nick Clegg's point?
No, I don't.
Why did you do so badly in Richmond?
Oh, no, our vote was terribly squeezed. That was always going to happen. We have not, historically, ever won in Richmond. We didn't expect to this time, but we thought it right to put up a candidate, but his vote got squeezed.
But it collapsed. I mean, you know, Labour members voted Liberal Democrat.
Krishnan, that's what happens in by-elections. That's how usually the Lib Dems get what they claim is a transformative result, because the Labour vote or the Tory vote collapses and they benefit. But I mean, I think we have to be really careful about extrapolating too much from Richmond. It's a very particular seat. It's one of a handful of seats, which is one of the most pro-Remain seats in the country. And to extrapolate from that there's some huge Lib Dem revival, I think would be false.
But is there a danger that wealthier Remainers go Liberal Democrats, poorer Leave voters go to UKIP, and Labour's squeezed in the middle?
First of all, you have to remember that in the Lib Dems' traditional heartlands, in the West Country, they're not pro-EU at all. So the kind of campaign that Sarah Olney won, was a great campaign, I'm very glad for her, the kind of campaign she waged in Richmond would not work in traditional Lib Dem heartlands. And as for, you know, all our voters going to UKIP...
You're way behind, aren't you, is the point? I mean...
Well, as for
you're being squeezed on both sides, you're way behind the Conservatives.
It's not as simple as that. The idea that all our voters are going to UKIP, actually, the number of actual Labour voters that have gone to UKIP is relatively small. The UKIP vote comes from people who never voted at all before, and Tories.
Let me bring in Crispin Blunt. This was a complete miscalculation, wasn't it, by the Conservative Party? I mean, you should have put up a candidate.
Well, I don't think that would have made the position any better. Zach was supported by a lot of colleagues from Parliament. He was a particularly good MP. He made it clear he was going to continue to support the government on confidence and finance measures. So there really wouldn't have been a lot of point. It would have ensured the victory of the Lib Dems had we done so. Now they managed to win anyway, which is a pity. It's very sad for Zach. He was a very fine MP, I think, and it's quite a sad day when someone who's as independent-minded as he is and has done such a good job for his constituency.
Well, they didn't think so.
In raising the issues of salience. Well, sure, and it looks as though the Brexit issue, in terms of people's concerns, may have trumped Heathrow. It may be that the full weight of the Liberal Democrat Party, desperate to begin to get some comeback in areas where they were strong once, but piled in there against an independent candidate, that may have had an effect as well. But I'm rather with Diane. I think we're in danger of over-interpreting from Richmond.
Yes, I mean, I suppose you two might both say that today of all days. But, I mean, let's just turn to Brexit. I mean, isn't this week the week where the government's position really emerged as much softer on Brexit than we had thought before? Boris Johnson talking up the benefits of immigration, David Davis saying we might well be paying Europe for years for access to the single market. I mean, we're not heading for a hard Brexit now, are we?
Well, what we head for is not really in our hands. It's in the hands of the 27 countries we're negotiating with, along with the European Parliament and the Commission. And the 27 countries are decisive in this, as is the European Parliament.
But do you feel
and
no
it's a
pressure
very
from this
complex
vote?
negotiation. No, because I don't think the UK position changes very much. Although the government are quite rightly using this time to assemble all the data in order to inform the negotiations, the rough outline of what the British position is going to be is not terribly difficult to discern. You've highlighted some of the issues. We're going to want to take sovereign control of immigration. What that means in terms of what the immigration policy actually is obviously quite a different question, but it's a red line that we would have the full authority to set our own immigration policy. We're going to want as much access to the single market as our partners are going to give us. They've got a much more difficult decision to make, because plainly as close a relationship as possible is in the interests of the 27, but their anxiety will be if it's seen as a success for the United Kingdom, what message does that send to other countries in Europe and the parties in Europe who are sceptical about the merits of the European Union?
Let me just bring Diane Abbott. Do you think we are now heading for a softer Brexit than we were before?
I don't know, because it's also shambolic. One day David Davis says something, Theresa May contradicts him.
But the signs are...
Well, I don't think so. One day Boris Johnson is saying that he's in favour of immigration and that he is in favour of freedom of movement. Next day he's denying it. The real issue we have is we don't know what Theresa May's plans are, and it's increasingly looking like a shambolic Brexit. And even if you're not a hardline pro-European like some of those people in Richmond, I think there's a lot of concern about the lack of clarity, and our job in Parliament is to make the Tories accountable.
So for clarity, Labour's position is we must stay in the single market?
Our position is that we respect the vote. We're not talking about reversing that vote.
So that's staying...
And our position is that, led by Keir Starmer, who's our shadow Brexit minister, we are going to subject what the Tories are doing to forensic examination.
OK, so you haven't answered that question, have you? I mean, is your position, because you want clarity, you say, from the government, so let's get some clarity from you, is your position that Britain should stay in the single market?
Our position is that we should have the maximum access to the single market. Otherwise, it'll be catastrophic for British industry.
Diane Abbott, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Crispin Blunt, thank you for joining us from Washington.
Whatever else the Richmond Park and North Kingston by-election result was, it appears to be the first electoral verdict on Brexit, and a pretty resounding one at that. Zac Goldsmith's decision to force the by-election in the wake of the Heathrow verdict by resigning as a Tory to stand as an independent backfired spectacularly. The seat had voted overwhelmingly Remain in the referendum, and so Goldsmith, an ardent Brexiteer, was trumped by a Liberal Democrat, Sarah Olney, who was also against the Heathrow expansion. The Liberal Democrats have portrayed the surprise victory as a rejection of a hard Brexit. So how will the result reverberate through the Brexit negotiations, and what are the implications for the traditional way of doing politics? Is party politics coming apart at the seams? Here's David Grossman.
It's a good morning. Start of many more. Start of many more.
The Lib Dems haven't had too much to cheer about since the last general election, but today they let out a collective victory roar. Taking Richmond from Zac Goldsmith tasted sweet indeed.
Well, we started the campaign talking about our opposition to Heathrow expansion, because that's what the by-election was called about. But as we went round talking to voters, we realised that Brexit was something that mattered a great deal more to them. There was a lot of anxiety, a lot of people very disappointed in the result. So, we started to get out our message about, we've always had a long history of pro-Europeanism. We campaigned very hard for Remain, and that went down really well with the voters.
A big Lib Dem victory, no doubt, but still just a small dot on the map in terms of becoming a government. Richmond Park and North Kingston is one of the UK's most affluent constituencies, making it far from typical politically.
For a start, the Lib Dems held this seat and controlled the council until very recently, so they've got a strong local base. And in Zac Goldsmith, they had almost the perfect candidate to oppose, an outspoken supporter of Brexit in an area that voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU. Is this seat, what happened here, is that replicable elsewhere in the country?
Yeah, absolutely. Gareth Roberts was the victorious Lib Dem agent in Richmond. He says this win shows the party can campaign nationally on opposing what he calls a hard Brexit.
We've got members who are enthused and heartened, who will go off, campaign, put the proper Remain argument, which I'm afraid wasn't put during the referendum, and they will go out there and they will travel up and down the country to make sure that that happens. So if we can do this in Richmond, we can do it elsewhere.
But where elsewhere? If we map the referendum results onto the constituency map of the UK, in the yellow are the Remain seats. Of them, 163 are now held by the Conservatives. But most are pretty marginal in Brexit terms. In only 18, excluding Richmond Park, did Remain reach 60% or more. And of those, the Lib Dems came second in the general election in only 4. That's Bath, Twickenham, Oxford West and Abingdon, and Hitchin and Harpenden. And only in the last of them did the MP, like Zach Goldsmith, support Brexit.
In Scotland, identifying yourself with the side of a referendum worked extremely well for the SNP. They were the only people on the side of the Yes campaign and so managed to mop up all those votes. I think the position is far more difficult for the Lib Dems. They've placed themselves very much at the heart of the centre ground, hoping to win back voters from Labour's move towards the left. But they've also lost people while UKIP has established themselves as the party of protest. So it's quite a difficult position for them.
Meanwhile, Labour's showing in Richmond was, on any measure, dire. Not even all their local members voted for their candidate. As a pro-Remain party, Brexit poses significant challenges for them too. Of the seats that supported Brexit, 149 are in Labour hands. However, again, most are pretty marginal in Brexit terms. Only 77 voted to leave the EU by 60% or more. And in 31 of those strong Brexit Labour seats, UKIP came second at the last general election.
Nearly 400 seats voted to leave the European Union, and a lot of those are in Labour heartland areas. And it's these areas with large working class voters that Labour needs to appeal to. But at the same time, their MPs and their prospective candidates, in a lot of cases, will have voted to stay part of the European Union. And so they have an incredibly difficult balancing act to try and win back those supporters who they need to hold on to and don't want to lose to a resurgent UKIP under their new leader.
The temptation in by-elections is always to read too much into a one-off result. But one thing we can say for certain, for the Lib Dems, Christmas 2016 has come a little early.
David Grossman, well, joining us from Southampton is Conservative MEP Daniel Hannan, who's just published What Next, about what Britain should get out, how Britain should get out of Brexit. And here with me, the former Director of Communications to Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell, and the Liberal Democrat, Pierre Ollie Grendo. Good evening to you all. First of all, Daniel Hannan, does the Richmond result matter?
Well, we should keep it in context. I think it's a real pity that Zach Goldsmith didn't get re-elected. He'd done the honourable thing, he stuck to his word. But of course, in a democracy, the voters are always right, and congratulations to Sarah Olney. But I think we should keep a sense of perspective here. She won 20,000 votes, and 17.5 million people voted leave.
Yeah, this was a by-election, though. I mean, this was the first verdict since that referendum on
Well, it was a
Brexit.
by-election in a very, very strong Remain area, a constituency where something like 70% of people voted Remain. Obviously, if there'd been a by-election in, say, Romford, it would have been a very different result. So it doesn't really tell us anything that we didn't know on the 24th of June.
Alistair Campbell, doesn't really matter. It's a single little snapshot in a seat that was overwhelmingly Remain, a metropolitan rich seat.
I mean, I don't think you should read, as David Grossman said, you shouldn't read that too much into it, but I do think there is out there, not just in places like Richmond, but around the country, a sense that the debate that we're having now is the debate that we should have had before June the 23rd. And I think people are beginning to worry that this government does not have a strategy, doesn't know how to handle these negotiations. The autumn statement, I think, really shook people up into, 2 trillion debt, all the talk of Daniel and his colleagues about more money for the health service. It looks like we'll end up with less money for the health service. I think this is all playing into the idea that Brexit means Brexit, says Theresa May, but Theresa May doesn't really know what Brexit means at all. And so people are getting confused. I think quite a lot of people are getting angry that actually the biggest decision that we've ever taken as an electorate, the government doesn't know how to handle it.
But that did not actually result in a good night for you last night. I mean, there were more members in Richmond than there actually were Labour votes, which would suggest that actually, tactical whatever, but they knew it was much better to vote for the Liberal Democrats than vote for you.
Well, I think that the Liberal Democrats, a bit like the SNP, do have a very, very clear line. I would like the Labour Party to be much clearer about fighting and holding the government to account in a way that I think Keir Starmer has been trying to do, but he's been completely undercut by John McDonnell, and I assume with Jeremy Corbyn's permission.
The truth is that Labour is in a mess over this, Ollie Grender, and I wonder, from your point of view, is it, as it can't really be, as Tim Fallon said, back with a big bang, because look at the the results you had in the referendum in a lot of your heartland areas, the south and the north. This is a specific metropolitan seat.
Well, I think nobody is going to argue that if you extrapolate anything from the general election result for us, it's going to look anything but bad. But what was extraordinary, and what by-elections often do, is they're kind of like a shock or an electric shock to a current situation. I knocked on a lot of doors in this by-election, and people were raising Brexit all the time. They have loads of questions. The questions are content-rich. They really want to know what is going to happen. And as the Institute for Government said, silence is not a strategy.
No, but does it
that
suggest...
is the strategy of the government.
Does this suggest that actually people have a different attitude towards... I mean, there's a pick and mix now, but also the attitude that actually Labour and Liberal Democrats should actually get together and not oppose each other in areas where there's a strong Remain vote to be had?
Well, I think there's a debate at the moment, which is a valid debate, about what happens, given that we're in the electoral politics we are. However, I think that, the Labour Party and the leadership of the Labour Party is in a very different place from the Liberal Democrats at the moment with regard to the Brexit question.
Daniel Hannan, do you think that a similar duality should exist between the UKIP and the Tories, and in order to get, as far as you were concerned, the best deal for Brexit, there should be much more alignment, much more working together?
I mean, all of those questions presuppose that we're somehow refighting the referendum, and we're not. I mean, more people voted to leave the European Union than have ever voted for anything. I don't think it's fair to say, as Alistair was doing just there, that no one knows what Brexit means. I mean, the very clear thing that people voted for was to take back control of our laws, so that instead of being subordinate before a European court, we take our own decisions. But that doesn't mean turning our backs on Europe. It doesn't mean...
What you might say is that Liberal Democrats, Labour, MPs in Northern Ireland, SNP are aligned against you. They have, in a sense, got a block.
Well, yes, but that was put to the country specifically on the issue. Should we leave the European Union or should we remain? And people voted to leave. And there's no point in sort of gurning about that. I do think it's reasonable, though, to say that it was a narrow margin, that the 52% can't disregard the 48%. We need to try and find a status that is looser than the existing one, that may go too far for some people, not far enough for others, but that both sides can at least live with.
So and I think that you accept, Daniel Hannan, because you have been so much the godfather of Brexit, if I might put it that way, you do accept that this is going to be a very tempered negotiation. Now, of course, we heard David Davis in Wales only yesterday, that actually it's not going to be a lot of what people in areas of high unemployment, areas of high immigration actually wanted.
Well, I think I've got slightly more sense than you have, Kirsty, of what they wanted, having spent the campaign speaking in a lot of those areas. And what people really wanted was to be back in charge again, that we should make our own decisions. Now, of course...
Back in charge
of course, that doesn't mean...
Let me put that to Alistair Campbell. Let's take Burnley, for example. Burnley voted strongly to leave. So, you have no locus there, the Labour Party, as it stands just now, because what you're offering them, the prospect of the negotiations that you want, is not what they want.
But if I said earlier that I think we're now having the debate that we should have had before the referendum. The referendum campaign on both sides was dire and awful and wretched. The public now, I think, are waking up to the consequences of what they've voted for. And I think that at some point, so you have to ask...
But that would suggest that's kind of patronising, because that would kind of suggest they didn't know what was happening in the first place.
It's not patronising at all. what Theresa May and others keep saying is the British public voted, they gave a very clear message. They didn't. Daniel, for example, Daniel was clear through the campaign, this is not a vote to come out of the single market. The Brextremists now are all saying this was a vote to come out of the single market. That debate is not yet settled.
On that basis, then, do you go along with people like Clive Lewis and Lisa Nandy and saying what you want is a progressive alliance? And actually you have to listen to the way people want their politics delivered, and it's not the way it's being delivered now. It's a more thoughtful politics, the more nuanced politics.
Well, look, Ollie's spent a whole life trying to get proportional representation. The public had a chance to change the voting system. They voted against it in a referendum.
Yeah, I seem to remember one day when Tony Blair was very happy to think about giving Ashton a seat in the cabinet.
He was, but I don't think out of this by-election. You talked in the introduction, this is leading to a great realignment. I don't think so at this stage. What I will say, that I think that Brexit, and nor is the next general election all going to be about Brexit, but where we are now is that Theresa May has said she's going to trigger Article 50. She's done it, to my mind, throwing away a very big card too early. And then we're going to get into negotiations where, frankly, I think we're going to see a lot of damage to this country and we're going to see Europe running rings around them.
Is hugging close hard Brexit. Why is she doing that? It's not because she necessarily believes in it. It's in order to manage her party. The last time a Conservative leader did precisely what they believed in with regard to Europe was John Major, rather than in order to manage the party. And I think that's a very significant problem, and that was certainly perceived on the doorstep. And if anything, what Richmond Park says, above all else, is stop and think again about this relentless and high-speed pursuit of hard Brexit.
Forgive me, but
because the way you're doing
it
is you're telling me. Let me ask Daniel Hannan.
To shut up, sit at the back, and not participate.
What about that?
At every opportunity, the Prime Minister has said she wants us to have the closest relationship with the EU. She says we're going to be their closest neighbour, their best friend. You know, no one is talking about ending our diplomatic, our military, our commercial, our security links with the EU. We're talking about living under our own laws while remaining engaged and interested in the affairs of our immediate neighbours. We have a huge stake in their prosperity, if for no other reason than that prosperous neighbours make good customers. So no one's talking about turning our backs on Europe. We're talking about a repatriation of powers within the context of a continuing commercial relationship.
Let's then look, because you say we're not going to relive, as Daniel says, the referendum, but moving forward, so what the Remainers want, because the Remainers are still out there, Ramoners or whatever they're called, and those Remainers who actually would like to see a second referendum are people like your former boss, Tony Blair, and he now wants to start up a not-for-profit institute. Do we need somebody like Tony Blair to lead the charge, a strong figure?
Well, I certainly think that look, anybody who's got a contribution to make this debate should be making it. Anybody who cares about the future of Britain, whatever side of the argument they're on, should be fighting for it. And I don't know anything in British political history that says if you lose a debate and you lose an argument, you have to sort of suddenly say you agree with people that you actually fundamentally disagree with and think are damaging the country.
Thank you all very much indeed.
I've been getting away with it all.